are two lines of stitching. This is back stitch and this is double running stitch. They look very similar. In fact, they're both made of the same thread. This is a size 8 pearl cotton. But there are some differences that you'll notice because these two stitches are actually worked differently. And you can see one difference on the reverse side. The reverse side of back stitch is kind of a messy stem stitch. The reverse side of the double running stitch is double running stitch because this is a reversible stitch. So let's look at how these two stitches are worked, and then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons. Now let's start with back stitch. Most people start back stitch by bringing the needle up one stitch length away from the end. Now notice that for all of these stitches I'm going to be using a stab stitch motion. So I'll stab straight down and then come back up. I don't like to do this stitch with a sewing motion because you will not get as neat an effect. Now I'm going to go back in at the beginning of the line. Then I'll come back up a stitch length away and then go back in right at the tip of that first stitch. Now here's the problem with this. You can do this, but now I'm stitching right into that knot. And that can be kind of difficult. You can end up getting stuck in that knot or pulling your thread. So instead of doing that, what I like to do when I'm beginning back stitch is I bring my needle and thread up at the beginning of the line and just make a stitch. Then I start doing the actual back stitch. So I'll come up a stitch length away and go back down into the tip of that previous stitch to the same point, go back down. So now for that stitch I did not have to stitch into a knot. And then I'll go back down and just work my way across that row until I have a solid line of stitching. Now let's look at the double running stitch. So for double running stitch, I'll bring my needle and thread up at the beginning of the line, and I'm going to work my way across that line with running stitch. So I went down and then brought my needle, I'll bring my needle and thread back up a stitch length away, come back down, and I'm going to work my way across that line with running stitch. So you have a stitch and a space, and a stitch and a space. Okay, so I'll just work my way across. Now, if you see antique English samplers from the 17th century, and you'll see stitching on there that's solid lines, and you might think that it is back stitch, but it's actually more likely double running stitch. Okay, so I've made my way across that line. Now when I come up at the end of the line, I'm going to go back the other way. So I bring my needle back in right at the tip of that last stitch. Then I have to come up at the tip of this stitch and go back in and work my way back to the beginning of the line. Okay, now here are some of the advantages of double running stitch. For one thing, it is a reversible stitch, so it would be very useful for clothing or anything. Like they would use it for collars and cuffs anytime you wanted to be able to see the reverse side. It's also more economical of thread because each stitch is not wrapping around itself. And it makes, I think, a smoother line. So if you don't see the individual stitches as clearly as you would with backstitch. Now, some of the advantages of backstitch. Backstitch, I think, is an easier stitch because as you work your way across with backstitch, you never have to try to bring your needle up into a thread. You're just going down into the thread. It's an easier stitch, I think, to conceptualize because you're starting at one end of a line and you're just stitching your way to the other end. And I think it's also a pretty stitch because sometimes you want to have a smooth line, but sometimes it's nice to see those individual stitches. So there is back stitch and double running stitch.